Welcome, everyone. I'd say we can start now with the symposium of today with the title, How Environment Shapes the Mathematical Brain, Influences of Socioeconomic Status, Parental Behaviors, and Education. And I'm very excited to hear these talks and also to hear about the discussion of these findings that we will see. So I will also quickly present Jérôme Prado. Are you going to, you're going to lead it?
Yes, I'm going to be the chair, and I'm going to introduce a bit of a symposium and the different speakers.
Perfect, then I'll give the word to you.
All right, well, I'll share my screen. I made a nice slide. It's going to be very quick because I'm just a chair. So welcome everyone to that symposium about really the relation between children's experiences and environment and the brain system underlying math skills. So I will be the chair. I'm Jérôme Prado from the Lyon Neuroscience Research Center in France. And we have 4 speakers today: Teresa Iuculano, Demir-Lira, Cléa, Girard, and Merel Declercq. And before basically presenting the lineup and the talks, I just wanted to give you a very quick overview of the motivation behind the symposium, really, and why we decided to put together something on that topic. It's going to be really quick. It's just one slide, but it's basically one of the main motivations probably is the fact that if you look at the literature in developmental neuroscience over the past 10, 15 years, there's really a growing number of studies looking at the relation between children's experience and environmental inputs and brain development, both from a structural and functional perspective. So here, for example, you have a study showing the brain regions in which you have a relation between cortical surface area and socioeconomic status. Here's, for example, another study in which the author showed a relation between parental inputs. So actually, that was conversational terms, I think, and brain activity during linguistic tasks. And so there's mounting evidence that you have these sort of relations. And of course, it's likely that you would have also similar relations between children's experiences and environmental inputs and the brain systems underlying math learning and math development. And especially given that there's also a growing number of studies looking at how these experiences basically relate to math skills and math development, both in school, but also out of school, in the family, at home, both looking at socioeconomic status and also on parental environment and learning environment. And so what we thought would be interesting would be to see if we could put together a group of researchers who would be interested in that specific question, which is right here, which is how children's experiences at school, but also out of school, affect the development of a numerical brain. And I just want to emphasize before starting that these are really early days to look at that question, because it's actually quite challenging from a developmental cognitive neuroscience perspective, probably because of, I think, 2 main things. The first one is that it's really a question about individual differences. Meaning that you probably need larger sample sizes that you typically have in neuroimaging studies. And so, and we know that neuroimaging studies, especially with fMRI with children, is hard. So that probably calls for probably more data sharing between labs to increase sample sizes, and also trying to look at techniques that are not necessarily fMRI, for example, fNIRS, and you'll see one example of that during the symposium. Another reason why I think this question is absolutely critical, but is also challenging, is that it's also a causal question. And so that will call for studies that go beyond cross-sectional designs involving either longitudinal or intervention studies. And you will also see examples of that in that symposium. So without further ado, the talks that you're going to hear today are the following. We're going to start with Teresa Iuculano from the CNRS and the University of Paris in France, who's going to talk about math problem solving skills in a sample of elementary school children from low economic status. It will be followed by Demir-Lira from University of Iowa, so it's much earlier back there. Parental numerical activities and child numerical processing. She's going to talk about that. Cléa Girard will follow. She's from the CNRS and the University of Lyon, and she's going to talk about the relation between the home environment and the numerical brain. And we will end the series of talk with Merel Declercq from Belgium, from the University of Leuven, who will talk about arithmetic learning in children using a training design. So perhaps, Teresa, you can start sharing your screen. I'm going to stop sharing mine.
Yeah. Let's see if it works.
So basically, each talk will be about 10 minutes long. We thought that maybe we would save most of the questions for a question session at the end. Unless you guys have maybe a clarification question or urgent questions between talks, there's probably there will probably some time for that. So just like write down in the chat or raise your hand. All right, Teresa, I think the floor is yours.
Cool. Can you guys hear me well? All right, cool. So good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I want to thank Jérôme for this opportunity and for organizing this very nice series of talks on environment and mathematical brain. My part is going to be on socioeconomic status and the mathematical brain, and I'm going to share with you two studies quite in the early days. But first, like a little introduction on socioeconomic status, SES, and school achievement, which is normally referred to as the educational achievement gap, or nowadays people prefer to call it educational opportunity gap. And children from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds are less likely to develop adequate math and reading proficiency. They're more likely to have learning disability than their peers from IRCS. And more critically, the gap between children performance between high versus low SES families continues to grow. And these effects are particularly pronounced for math, even more than reading. Math is a very hierarchical subject. So if you're stuck on one skill, you cannot really proceed. And in fact, a recent PISA report states that a more socioeconomically advantaged student scores 39 points higher in math, the equivalent of the 1 year of schooling, than a less advantaged student. And this is just for fun. I've circled France. I could have circled Italy, the US, but you can see on the x-axis the countries, and on the y-axis is this achievement gap. So the higher the bar, the biggest the achievement gap. So France is not doing very well. The US, just a little bit better. So why are low SES children struggling so much with math? And I'm gonna guide you through a proposal and just some ideas that I have and some data that hopefully supported that potentially it might have to do with the stress and the anxiety that these kids are put under. So SES households can be highly charged with stress and anxiety. It's a prominent feature in the daily lives of children from low SES. This has been reported and documented, and you can just imagine that these kids are part of overcrowded households. There's scarcity of resources, constant money preoccupations, low SES parents where schedules can be very hectic, or job insecurity. And these kids can have therefore higher behavioral and emotional problems than their more fortunate peers. And for example, a couple of studies have shown that these kids can develop an early sensitivity to threats, leading to dysregulated emotional control, which can negatively, obviously, affect learning. And something that's quite interesting because it brings in this physiological perspective is that there is a tight link between neuropsychological markers of stress, such as cortisol levels and low SES. This is a seminal study by Leuven, and you can see it grows. So this bar, if you can see it's not a pointer, it's just a mouse. Low SES by the age of 10, they show differences in salivary cortisol levels from medium or high SES kids. And talking about anxiety or stress, I would like to also introduce another topic that most of you are familiar with, which is math anxiety, which is defined by many of us, I guess, as a negative emotional reaction that's characterized by feeling of stress, situations involving math problem solving, and it's very prevalent. And obviously, we all know there's a vicious cycle. So here's the proposal. This is my sort of working model and essentially the hypothesis. I'm predicting the low SES will have higher stress and anxiety. This will lead to not just general anxiety, but more pronounced math anxiety, and that might impact math performance. So this is the first study. This is part of my PI effort since I moved to Paris. It's done by two amazing students. It's a study on 7 to 9-year-olds, second and third graders. We had 67 kids, which were split into low and high SES. And in this case, we defined low and high. High SES were kids from a private school in Paris, and low SES were part of what in France it's called the REP or REP Plus program, which essentially identifies, the government identifies schooling districts that are in large, that show large inequalities. So that's how we split our groups, and our measures were of general math anxiety, and math performance. We got our SEMAs, the SEMA, which we all know, and the Woodcock-Johnson fluency. So comparing the groups, we found that this is low SES and this is high SES. There's a significant difference on their fluency scores. Obviously, low SES are underperforming. General anxiety, they have higher levels of general anxiety compared to their high SES peers, and also of math anxiety. So I found this quite interesting because I thought this was going to be the case, but I didn't think it was going to be quite there, just with a small sample. And then I went on, as Jérôme was talking about, cross-sectional and individual differences approach, like correlations and stuff. This is correlating math anxiety. Here's the SEMA with the fluency, and you can see that there is a negative correlation, very well expected. However, when I split the groups, we saw that actually only in the low SES group, the correlation was significant and negative. And while the ISCS group sort of showed a little bit of a flatter curve. Actually, in terms of general anxiety and math performance, we didn't find any significant correlations either in the big group or in the two small groups. However, when we ran a mediation model, we did see that this is the general anxiety, and math scores. There was a significant mediation, indirect mediation on this model. And so poor math performance in low SES seems to be driven by higher levels of anxiety and math anxiety, which is the mediator. But is this the whole story? And of course, I'm a brain scientist, and so here comes the brain part. And I did promise Jérôme I was gonna give a little bit of the brain data. So Jérôme already touched on this. Various studies by now have documented aberrances of multiple brain features in relation to low SES. And they include mostly structural ones, reduced volume, surface area, thickness of temporal frontal mostly, and parietal regions, as well. This is a lovely review by Marta Farah in 2017, and also subcortical regions. One of the main players is the hippocampus that shows differences between related to SES. And as I was looking at this literature, I kept thinking that some of these systems are quite important, well, for learning in general, obviously, but also for math problem solving. So we're talking about the prefrontal, parietal cortices, and the hippocampus. And so here's sort of how I started to build the model a little bit further, and thinking that maybe there is also a brain plasticity component that makes it so that low SES kids show poor math performance. So I'm going to go, so this is a much smaller sample. It's very hard, as Jérôme was saying. It's the same age range, 7 to 9-year-olds. These kids are from the States. This is a project from my previous job at Stanford. And here we split the groups in low and high SES. It's only 7 each in order to match everything. And in this case, the criteria for low SES or high SES was getting parental education information and parental income information, which is much easier to get in the States, actually. And we got general anxiety measures, the CBCL anxiety subscale, and math anxiety, the CMA again. And in the scanner, some of you might know some of my work. So this is the usual task that I always present. It works pretty well. It's arithmetic verification, right, wrong, and then the control task is a number identification. And we looked at performance during this task. So quickly on the brain results, actually, I was quite surprised, to be honest. Most of the things I found in my experience with this task and kids that were struggling with math were overactivation of the frontoparietal system and potentially the hippocampus as well. While here, you can see this is the contrast. High SES show greater activation than low SES. And the low SES kids don't show any greater activation in any brain region compared to high SES. The color coding is, again, it's 7 kids and 7 kids. So I started with a very exploratory threshold. However, the lighter blue shows actually a kind of legitimate threshold to sort of be thinking about it. Obviously, I'm not making any big claim, but what I did afterwards, I looked in each group at the model that I was thinking about. And for the 3 regions of interest, the LPFC, IPS, and the hippocampus, even though the hippocampus has like slightly less strong results. And this is, I'm just going to scroll through the models. CBCL, general anxiety, math performance, and each brain region activation. And you can see that there is a link between anxiety and math anxiety, but also between anxiety and functional activation in this region, not so much here. However, for the DLPFC, every link actually shows a significance. And the same goes for the hippocampus. So everything but the parietal cortex, which, however, shows something quite interesting. When we looked at high SES kids, actually, we didn't see it. We didn't see this links between general anxiety and functional or math anxiety. However, we did see the usual, math anxiety with math performance and functional activation with math performance. Similarly for so this is the IPS, this is for the DLPFC, and actually the hippocampus has slightly a different profile. Still, there's no link here, and there's no link here, but I'm happy to talk about it. I'm not sure, again, this is very, very preliminary, but I thought I'd just put it out there. So just to wrap up, we can start, maybe think about different profiles between high and low SES elementary school children might be of math problem solving, might be a function of general anxiety and math anxiety. And something that sort of caught my attention here, I sort of reversed them because I needed to put the kind of inverted U shape idea in such that, maybe if you have too much stress, then you're going to do bad, but maybe the high SES kids, they just have the right amount of stress or something like that. Again, something to explore. And obviously, general anxiety seems to be a factor involved in poor math performance, but only via math-specific anxiety. And so this was the behavioral result from study 1. Well, for study 2, different profiles between low and high SES could be a function of general anxiety, math anxiety, and brain activation during math problem solving. And here I've sort of tried to summarize that for the DLPFC hippocampus, you get sort of like this whole mediation links. For the low SES and the high SES, the profile is quite different. Let's just not talk about the hippocampus. And it might be due to physiological reasons as well. So actually, it's quite interesting. I thought that the DLPFC in low SES and the hippocampus are the ones that are showing like the strongest effects, as these 2 regions have been shown to be the most vulnerable to stress, mostly in terms of structural features. So the sort of idea could be that some critical brain systems might be disrupted in low SES, and therefore that could lead actually to hyperactivation. So it's not really that it's their brain is working over hard, like for example, dyscalculic kids, but they just show a completely different profile, which could be due to anxiety sort of disrupting the systems. I went a little over, I guess. I just wanted to acknowledge all the people that helped out, and the study is in its infancy, obviously, and it's funded by a bunch of little grants, but yeah, hopefully we'll get more solid results soon. Thanks.
Thank you, Teresa. Okay, well, I think we could go ahead and maybe Eche, you can share your screen and start our next presentation, so we can try to have time for the discussion at the end.
Can you see the screen okay?
Yep.
Perfect. So good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, depending on where you are joining us. I also would like to thank Jérôme for putting this nice symposium together, and thank you, Teresa, for the very nice talk. So I'm Demir-Lira, and I'll be presenting a project on the relations between parent-child numerical activities and child numerical processing. But I have to start with a full disclaimer and inform you that this will be more talk, less action. In other words, more talk, less data. So we were on a quite a good path in terms of our neuroimaging data collection right when the COVID hit. So we had to pause it. So instead, I'm going to use this time to present or share our research plan. That is our design, our methods, and our predictions. And on the path to those, however, I will try to mitigate the absence of data by sharing with some behavioral findings that motivates our research program. So overall, my goal today is to highlight the relevance of environmental differences approach for our understanding of children's numerical processing. And hopefully at the end of the talk, you will think about the role of parent-child numerical activities for your research program a little more than you do now. So I wanted to start with a review. This is the symposium's focus, how environment shapes the mathematical brain, which is at the intersection of these three bodies of work. And interestingly, we know little about this exact overlap, but we know quite a bit about how these different areas interact with each other two at a time. Obviously, in the context of the conference as well, we heard a lot about the fact that children greatly vary in their numerical processing, and some of this variability can be attributed to differences in the environment, specifically parent-child interactions. Similarly, we know quite a bit about the cognitive neuroscience of children's numerical processing. And finally, as Jérôme touched upon, there's a rich body of literature examining the role of environmental differences, specifically the role of parental factors in developmental cognitive neuroscience. But again, we don't know much about the intersection of all these three areas, and this is the gap we wanted to fill in our research. So we asked, how does the neurocognitive base of numerical processing vary as a function of parent-child numeracy interactions? And we specifically focused on non-symbolic and symbolic number processing. I don't have to define it for this group, but symbolic numbers are precise representations of numerical values, such as numerals or number words, whereas non-symbolic numerical representations are estimates, right? Magnitude estimates, such as estimating number of dots on a page. So very briefly, right, if we start with the first corner of our Venn diagram, we had very interesting talks on this, and Stephanie Bogdan has a nice figure summarizing this literature, developmental changes in the neurocognitive base of numerical processing. The general emerging pattern is that right IPS might be involved in processing non-symbolic magnitudes starting from early in life, and its contribution may be relatively stable over development. So it might be there before formal education or language, whereas we see increased developmental specialization in left IPS, which might reflect acquisition of symbolic representations in slightly older children. So in other words, it might reflect more experience-dependent changes in symbolic representations as a function of children's increasing comfort or fluency with symbolic representations. We also know that left IPS is related to individual differences in behavior, such as behavioral performance in symbolic number processing. And recently there has been a greater emphasis on the contribution of frontal areas that might be specifically involved when children are first acquiring symbolic representations of numbers, and they might reflect possibly this, immature associations with the symbolic representations they have, and the semantic values or semantic values of these representations in memory. So given these, we focused on the frontal and parietal areas in our work. But again, these represent just general patterns, but we know from a very rich behavioral work that, as I said, children greatly vary in their number processing, and these could be tied to parent-child number activities. There's a really nice review by Mutaf that just came out in 2020, highlighting the fact that parent-child activities around numbers, such as counting, memorizing math facts, but also talking about measurement in the context of cooking, as well as specific talk about numbers, quantity and quality, predict children's mathematical skill. But even in this literature, we know little about the relations between these different activities and non-symbolic and symbolic number in the context of a single study. So while we don't know much about how this behavioral work relates to the previous body of work I just talked about, there's a rich body of literature examining the role of parental factors in developmental cognitive neuroscience, especially in the domain of executive function, working memory, and language. And some recent work, including our own, touched upon the role of parental socio-economic status in mathematical processing. So we show that when we focus on older children and their single-digit arithmetic processing, we find variability at the neurocognitive level as a function of SES. More specifically, the higher the SES, the higher was the activation in what we call verbal areas, such as IFG and MTG, for children who perform well on these single-digit arithmetic tasks. Whereas for children at the lower end of the SES continuum, the higher the performance, the higher was the activation in parietal areas. Again, highlighting that there might be relations between these environmental factors and the activation patterns. Obviously, one limitation of this work is that we don't know what is it about SES that might be associated with these differences. And also here in this set of studies, we focused on children in the elementary school years. So we also don't know how these differences emerge early in life, which was some of the motivation for our work. And although we don't know about the specific mechanisms by which SES might relate to differences in the brain level, again, a separate work in language processing showed that, as Jérôme highlighted, variability in left IFG activation in the context of a language test might be related to the parental language input children receive from their parents, highlighting it as a possible factor. So we wanted to know, how does the neurocognitive base of symbolic and non-symbolic processing vary as a function of parent talk about numbers, but also activities that parents provide. So try to get a more comprehensive view of the parent-child interactions. We aim to use fNIRS, functional near-infrared spectroscopy, since it has relatively better resolution, temporal resolution than fMRI, and slightly better spatial resolution than EEG. But most important, for our purposes, it's quite cost-effective and relatively very easy to use with young children, like 4- and 5-year-olds. And for those of you who are interested in, Sultanlu has a nice review summarizing the use of fNIRS in mathematical processing. So we aim to have 50 right-handed participants, 4.5 to 5.5-year-olds, English-speaking monolingual children, in a relatively higher SES US college town. And we plan to elicit number talk from parents using a picture book that has variability. It does include some information about numbers, but it also has a nice story, and it does elicit variability in how much and how parents talk about numbers. And we also gave them this card matching task where we ask parents to match these shape cards to number cards. We also ask parents to report different parent-child numeracy activities, such as formal complex activities. Do they memorize math facts? Formal simple activities, do they engage in counting? And some informal activities, such as do they engage in measuring while cooking? We also have some questions about this, but I'm not going to touch upon it. In terms of our specific design, we use the non-symbolic and symbolic task. We use an explicit numerosity discrimination task We counterbalance for the correct size, density, and we also had the explicit symbolic comparison task. And we started collecting data using a TechN system, and our probe covers areas of interest in the frontal and parietal areas. Most importantly, what were our predictions? So we predicted that the higher the input, the higher will be the left parietal activity for symbolic, but not for non-symbolic tasks, given the prior literature highlighting increased developmental specialization in left IPS. We did not predict strong relations between input and non-symbolic and symbolic in terms of activity in the right parietal. And then in terms of frontal activation, again, we predicted that the richer the input the children receive, the higher will be the activation in frontal areas in symbolic, but probably not for the non-symbolic task. And to start out, we will consider input as a composite. So we will create a composite score of the input children receive to get a more representative measure, but we will also divide it up into more complex versus more simple types of input as well. So while we couldn't collect neuroimaging data, we wanted to at least get some behavioral data on the tasks that we designed. So we recently converted this to an online format and collected data via Zoom. So this represents just very pilot data from 16 kids in our symbolic and non-symbolic tasks. Kids are performing above chance, and the performance is not significantly different in the two tasks. And more important for our purposes, there is variability in performance. And then we wanted to see, again, very exploratory, how does this relate to parent-child activities? And what we saw was that formal complex numerical activities was related to the symbolic number processing as well as non-symbolic. I'm not going to present nominal p-values given that this is just pilot data, but we did not see any patterns of association for formal simple tasks or in the informal activities, formal simple activities or informal parent-child numerical activities. So going forward, we want to complete the behavioral study, analyze the numerical talk, analyze relations to mathematical processing, and hopefully, fingers crossed, start data collection in spring. So this is where I started. Hopefully I was able to give you a view of the plan we have and highlight the relevance of this approach for our understanding of numerical processing. I'll end here and I'll just acknowledge my team and our funding agencies.
Thank you, Eche, for this nice pre-registration talk. So now you're good with that. All right, let's go to Cléa, who can share her screen.
So yes, hello everyone. I'm very glad to present you our study about the relation between the home environment and the numerical brain. So we know for decades that there exist important inter-individual differences in math skills, and critically, these differences already exist before the beginning of formal schools and they tend to persist through life. So an important question is to understand where do these early differences come from? And one of the explanations could be to take in consideration the effects on the home environment on math learning. So the first used measure to characterize the home environment is the familial socio-economic status, which is a broad measure which usually includes at least parental education and parental income. And socio-economic status has been related to children numeracy outcomes in many studies through many countries, like highlighted in PISA reports. And socioeconomic status has also been related with neuroimaging results. So differences, variation has been shown in structural brain or in functional neuroimaging results. But in fact, almost all these results concern language-related brain regions, mostly frontal or temporal brain regions. And most functional studies use language-related tasks. And even when the effect of socioeconomic status was studied on math processing, the effect has been found in temporal regions, which is also a language-related region. But maybe the fact that the task was a single-digit arithmetic task, which is known to rely on verbal information from long-term memory, could explain the fact that even for math processing, results were found in language-related region. So that's why in our study, we wanted to test whether we could find a more direct link between parental socioeconomic status and children's number brain processing. So for that, we look at more basic numerical brain processing to test whether socioeconomic disparities could be linked with different levels of activities in brain areas processing core numerical activities. So in the intraparietal sulcus, the IPS. So to do that, we recruited 47 8-year-old children and their parents, and they completed a math fluency task to assess both parents and children's math skills. And parents completed a questionnaire to assess their socioeconomic status. And children completed an fMRI adaptation task from a paradigm proposed in a recent study of Replication and colleagues. So their idea is quite simple. Via a robust block paradigm, which does not require any behavioral responses, their stimuli were presented either in a non-adaptation block. So that means different stimuli during the block period, which is associated with an increase of the neural activity, either in an adaptation block, which means this time only the same stimulus during the block period, which is associated with a decrease of the neural activity. And interestingly, the authors have found for their neural adaptation task with words as stimuli, they have found results of adaptation in the classical readings areas. So that means that with this paradigm adaptation, they are able to find results of adaptation in well-established functional neural networks. So we use this same task by just converting the word stimuli into French word stimuli, and we also adapted their task with digits as stimuli. So it looked like this, either an adaptation block with the same stimuli, either a non-adaptation block with different stimuli. So we used two different tasks, one with only digit as stimuli and the other one with only words as stimuli. And just to maintain children's attention on the screen, we ask them to perform a detection task. So just to press a button when a target appears on the screen. So what about our result? First, about the relation between brain processing and children's math fluency score. We obtained a correlation between digit adaptation and children's math fluency score in several brain regions, including the a priori predicted IPS. So that means that children with higher math fluency score had better digit processing in all these red areas, including the IPS. And there was no relation between broad processing and children's math fluency score anywhere in the brain. So we used the voxels showing a positive relation between digit processing and math fluency score in the IPS as region of interest for next analysis. And for next analysis about brain processing, we systematically controlled for children's and parental math fluency scores. So what relation did we measure for parental socioeconomic status? First, in our sample, we did not obtain any relation with children's math skills, but we did obtain a relation with the digit processing with both parental education and parental income. And critically, this relation was specific to digits, that there was no relation between socioeconomic status and word processing. So that means that children with higher socioeconomic status had enhanced activity in the IPS during digit processing. So in this first part, we have shown that disparities in family socioeconomic status may relate to functional differences in the IPS, which is a core region to process numerical information. But we know that socioeconomic status is a broad measure, and we wanted to test the influence of the home environment with more proximal measures. So we wanted to answer these second questions. Are home math activities provided by parents also related to the IPS activity during math processing? Indeed, another way to understand the math learning at home is to consider these home numeracy activities. And the concept of home numeracy environment has been investigated by a growing number of studies this last decade. So parents and children could share formal numeracy activities at home. That means activities in which parents explicitly intend to teach numerical skills to their child. And this activity could be either basic or advanced, depending on if they challenge the child or not. Like, for example, in our 8-year-old sample, a basic formal math activities could be counting objects, whereas more advanced formal math activities could be dividing double-digit numbers. And parents and children could also share informal numeracy activities. That means everyday opportunities for children to be exposed to math contents, like during playing board games or cooking. And we know that these different home numeracy activities have been related to children numeracy outcomes, but it seems to depend to both the type of the activity, either formal or informal, and also at the level of complexity, either basic or advanced. However, we don't know yet if these activities, these home math activities, could also be related to children's brain numerical processing. So in fact, in our study, we also used our parental questionnaire to assess the frequency of different home numeracy activities. So we assess informal math activities, but also basic and advanced formal math activities. So what relation did we measure with these different home numeracy activities? So first, with children's math fluency skills, we did not obtain a relation with either informal practices or basic formal practices, but we did obtain a relation with advanced formal math activities. That means activities that were challenging for the child. So that means that parents who engaged in more frequent advanced home math activities are children with better math skills. So after that, we wanted to say if there is a relation with digit processing. In fact, there was an equivalent pattern of results, so no relation with informal, no relation with basic formal, but we did obtain a relation with advanced formal math activities and the digit processing in the IPS. And critically, once again, the relation was specific to digits. There was no relation between parental socio-economic status and word processing with any of the math activities. So that means that children who benefit from more frequent advanced formal math activities show enhanced activity in the IPS during digit processing. So we think that, so now some element to discuss this result, we think that our results add to the research framework on the relation between the home environment and the children's math performance by showing a potential neural correlate, because we have shown that both disparities in socioeconomic status and home numeracy environment are related to variation in the IPS, which is a key math brain regions. And our results are consistent with previous work. We have shown that some aspects of the home environment are also related to children's brain processing, but only for language domain. And the first limitation of our study, it's because of its cross-sectional design. It doesn't not allow us to infer any causal link between family environment and children's brain activity. And the second limitation is the sample size. Even if, despite the fact that the sample size was relatively large for a task-related study with 8 years old children, it remains quite limited, and we think that future studies should further these findings. So to conclude, based on our data, it appears that both higher socioeconomic status and more challenging formal math activities may be associated with enhanced brain sensitivity to numerical information in the IPS. And I would like to conclude by thanking the past and the present member of the BBL lab and all the children and their families who participated in our study. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Cléa. Let's go to Merel now. And
hi, can you all hear me?
We can hear you.
All right. And you can see my presentation fine?
As well.
All right, let's get started then. So my name is Merel. First of all, thanks to Jérôme for inviting me to this talk. I'm very honored to be in the presence of these other researchers. Today I'm going to talk about an arithmetic training study that I did in children in order to show you how that training shaped the mathematical brain. So first of all, I want to go over this real quickly about the cognitive development that happens for arithmetic. So when children start to learn arithmetic items, these items are difficult. They require a lot of brain power to solve, and they can either be solved using finger counting or repeated addition or a decomposition strategy. But in general, they need procedures, they need intermediate steps to find the correct solution. But over time, during development and thanks to learning and education, some of these arithmetic items will be stored into, well, the solutions to those arithmetic items will be stored into long-term memory and then can be retrieved from memory in some cases. And then we talk about arithmetic fact retrieval. And for adults, we already know quite well how these different strategies modulate the brain. And we see that for procedural strategies, there's a full frontal parietal network that is active when solving arithmetic items in, that needs a procedural strategy. Well, for arithmetic fact retrieval, the angular gyrus and the supramarginal gyrus are more fine as results for in adults. And one way that this has been studied quite extensively is in the training studies, where you start with difficult items that are unknown, so solved with procedures, and by training them and exposing your participants repeatedly to the same items, they will be started to be retrieved from memory and to be stored as an arithmetic fact. However, in children, it's a bit more unclear what is happening there. For the procedural strategies, we also see a frontal parietal network in children, but for arithmetic fact retrieval, the angular gyrus is not very well, is not a finding that is replicated very widely, although the hippocampus seems to be more important in these younger children for arithmetic fact retrieval, leading to the hypothesis that the involvement of the hippocampus in arithmetic fact retrieval or in the development of arithmetic is a more time-dependent role, where the hippocampus is more important during the development, while the angular gyrus in adults is like the end point, the final point of arithmetic fact retrieval. But this has not been done in this training study has not been done in children as it has been in adults. So that was actually the first aim of this arithmetic training study, actually to replicate these adult training studies, but in a younger sample of 10-year-old kids. A second aim of this study was, so most of the adult studies and most of the training studies that are on arithmetic, that exist on arithmetic, do this training, and then after the training they do an fMRI session where they can compare trained items with untrained items. But there's also some literature that shows that it's also very important to include a functional scan before the training, and so you can fully map the changes that occur because of the training, and not only because you at the post-training you compare trained with equally difficult but untrained items. Then a third aim of this study was to include a third experimental condition. So instead of only focusing on trained items and also difficult but untrained items, we also wanted to include a third task complexity level, in the sense that we also included a simple items in our scanning session. So items that are very easy, very well known in these children, and are solved using very efficient fact retrieval. So we did this study in 26 well, we started with more, but we ended up with 26 participants after correcting for motion in the scanner. They were 10-year-old and all typically developing children. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about how the training looked like. The training was an at-home training, and we did that before it was cool in 2020 to do everything at home. For 6 days, they had to solve these double-digit multiplications, so these difficult multiplications that you do not know by heart if you haven't trained them. And then they had to type in the answer, press enter, and then they got feedback when they were correct or incorrect, or if they needed to be a little bit quicker. So these are the results for the training. We were very pleased to see that children are able to learn these new difficult arithmetic items during the training for 6 days. As you can see on the left y-axis, it's the error percentage that is depicted with the dark gray bars. You can see that the dark gray bars decrease, so that means that they are making less mistakes. And that was a significant difference between training day 1 and 2, and then it kind of stabilizes. And then for reaction time, which is the lighter gray line on the graph and the right y-axis, you can see that their reaction time starts at around 6.4 seconds on training day 1 and then decreases significantly between each training day until they halve it at day 6 for about 3 seconds to solve these difficult items. Then I'm also, of course, going to talk a little about the fMRI part of this study. So we did 2 scanning sessions, one before the training and one after the training, and each of these sessions had 3 conditions, 3 experimental conditions. So first was the to be trained or trained multiplications. Then there was also the untrained multiplications. These were equally difficult double-digit multiplications that were not part of the training. And then also, as I already said, the simple multiplications that they already know very well, like 4 times 3, for example. We had 10 items for each of the conditions, which were repeated multiple times over the course of 6 runs. It was a block design, and it was like this, that they saw the multiplications for a couple of seconds, and then they got then they got 2 answer possibilities, one of which was right, one was wrong, and then they had to indicate which one of them was correct. So the results of the replication, we checked the post-training. This is only post-training, comparing the untrained items with the trained items, and we can see, we see in adults, a very similar frontal-parietal network that is active for these items. A little bit more surprising was the trained minus untrained condition contrast, where we expected to see hippocampal activation with the hypothesis of the time-dependent role of the hippocampus, but that was not the case. We only saw significant activation in the left medial orbital frontal gyrus. One of the ideas that we have, or one of the hypotheses that we have, is that so for the untrained items, these are these difficult multiplications. And children, we have done a strategy assessment where they tell us that they solve these items. For example, if you have 14 times 3, they solve that by 10 times 3 plus 4 times 3. And those 10 times 3 and 4 times 3, these are actually facts that they are going to retrieve from memory. So one of the hypotheses is that, one of the explanations here is that we couldn't find any results there, is that maybe the factor retrieval of the untrained items, which are actually procedural items, kind of masks the results of the trained items, as it's both a type of factor retrieval. Then for our second aim, we checked the same items but before and after training, which was also very surprising that we could not find any significant clusters for the to-be-trained items so in the pre-training fMRI session. And for the post-training fMRI session, we could only find activation in the IPS, in the left IPS. Again, one of the things that we think might have happened is that although we see very clear behavioral results of the training, that the length of the training might have not been optimized to see also changes at the or more results at the brain. And then I'm going to go a little bit quicker. For the last aim was to also include these simple items, so these very well-known multiplications. And I'm going to start to talk about the upper left contrast. Again, this is pre-training. So before the training, we see the frontal parietal network that keeps showing up for these difficult types of items which are solved procedurally. While for the simple items pre-training, so these items which we know are very well known and solved using fact retrieval, we actually see angular activation in the angular gyrus and in the temporal, the mid-temporal gyrus. So these are very expected results. And then for the post-training session, we see that all the activation differences between these two conditions actually kind of almost completely disappears. This is the same contrast with post-training, and we see that only in the occipital lobe and a little bit of in the precentral gyrus activation remains, as well as here. Showing that actually the trained condition and the simple condition are becoming more similar and more alike, showing that the brain reacts to them in the same way, which we expect is because training was able to make these trained items into arithmetic facts. So real quick, we do see brain activity in children that differs from what has been observed in adults for a couple of the contrasts, but not always as we expected and hypothesized. And we think that might be because of two reasons. First of all, being the training not being of the optimal length for the neuro effects, and also that there is a slight overlap between the solving strategies between different task complexities and the difficulties, especially between trained and untrained. But we hope to find more results and because it's quite an elaborate design by doing representational similarity analysis and also some functional collectivity. So that was it. I hope everything was clear and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Merel. Yeah, I think I'm not sure I did a great job at timekeeping because I don't know how much time we have for questions, but I would like to open the floor for questions. So I see a question from Merel from David. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. That was very interesting. I have what might be a naive question, so just correct me if this is technically impossible, but I was interested by your comment that the failure to find all of the expected differences between trained and untrained items might be because they were both relying on some degree of simple arithmetic fact retrieval that was masking the differences possibly that might exist in complex arithmetic fact retrieval. But you also have patterns of activation from the simple arithmetic task. So I wonder if you can use the data from that task to kind of factor out the shared reliance on simple arithmetic fact retrieval, and might that then reveal a difference between the trained and untrained items?
Yeah, we tried that. We tried a couple of ways to approach that by including a covariate that included the simple items. We tried several constructions, but actually the results didn't change significantly enough to what's the English word? The results were very similar, and it made it very complex to make the interpretations, and that's why we didn't feel like it was clear enough to include it in the results.
Okay.
But we tried different concepts, to do that.
Thanks.
other questions? Let me know in the chat if you have other questions. If not, I would have a question for Teresa about the hippocampus, given that you didn't want to talk about the hippocampus. So I'm gonna, no, my question is that, and actually I'm not sure I know this answer, how is there evidence that actually SES has been related to hippocampal differences in terms of structure and function? And so what would you expect there in your task?
So, well, first of all, it's not that I didn't want to talk about it. I
No,
thought I
I'm
was
joking.
like in time, but no. So actually, it's more related to stress. There is this work by Karian, who is actually at Stanford, is a clinician, and it's been shown by him, by many others as well, that trauma or high levels of stress has a very, very big impact on the hippocampus. Why that is? Potentially because of the highly plastic properties of the hippocampus, and therefore it could be, changed for the good and for the bad. That's just my interpretation. Particularly for SES per se, there is a little bit less. I was more like hinting at the idea that it will be, because it will be mediated through anxiety, and the hippocampus is very, very sensitive to anxiety, in structural for sure. So that has been shown quite a bit, and many like trauma or very, very highly stressed clinical even populations or something like that, but even less. So that was kind of my idea. And then the reason why there wasn't a mediation between, or a link between the hippocampus and math skills in the high SES group, that was kind of surprising. However, it's possible that my interpretation is that maybe they're not, talking about fact retrieval and the role of the hippocampus in forming memories. Then it's possible that this particular sample, and it's again 7 kids, so it's really hard to tell, but they're not really probably engaged in the hippocampus, as Merel was sort of like hinting at. Sorry, long answer.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for the speakers? Well, then I have a question for Echina. No, I was. It's actually kind of really interesting to see the parallel between your study and our study, in the sense of the dissociating the different practices and how they would relate. And it's more about informal. And I don't remember actually what your prediction were for informal activities. Actually, are you predicting that they would relate more to non-symbolic processing than symbolic processing? Because it's been basically what one of the arguments in the literature, right? And so you would have this sort of like dissociation between formal, which would be more symbolic, and informal that would be more non-symbolic. Do you actually predict this sort of dissociation as well?
That's very interesting. So we definitely wanted to first look at the composite of input, as I said, to get a larger variability. But given the recent systematic review and papers, we did think that formal, especially at this age, complex, might be more related to symbolic. But I agree with you. These informal activities, playing with blocks, playing with cards, might be related to non-symbolic. I didn't predict that specifically, but that's definitely a possibility and has been there in the behavioral literature. These more as you said, informal activities might relate to non-symbolic at this age. Because that's kind of is consistent with our results with the older kids too, right? In lower SES, we did see that these parietal systems were correlated with numerical performance. And one of our explanation for that was that there might be activities at the lower end of the SES continuum that's not as heavily reliant on language, because we see strong SES variability in the language, but there might be other activities that these kids have that don't heavily rely on language and might predict reliance on parietal. So that's definitely a possibility.
thank you. Well, if there is no other question, I think we are running out of time. Just making sure. All right. Well, thank you all. I hope the symposium was interesting for everyone. I did enjoy it, so thank you very much.
Thank you too, Jérôme.
Thank you, Venera.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice day.